Cinematologist Podcast, Episode 142, Hannah Strong. In this episode, Neil talks to writer Hannah Strong about her new book on Sofia Coppola, Sofia Coppola, Forever Young, recently published by Abrams Books. The conversation covers Coppola's career, her signature styles, the Coppola shot, and Hannah's very personal relationship to those films and what they've meant to her over the years. Elsewhere in the episode, Neil and Dario talk about what are perceived as Coppola's limitations and ask questions about what we demand of filmmakers, what we expect of filmmakers, and what we hope filmmakers expect from themselves, particularly those fortunate enough to have a long career. On with the show.
Welcome to the Cinematologist Podcast. I'm Dario Linares, and down the line, of course, is my good friend Neil Fox. Neil, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm very well, thank you. It's, the marking's done, so that's good. And I was on set this week for a short film that I'm executive producing.
Lovely. Can you say anything about it?
Yeah, I can. It's called The Bird Watcher. It's the new film from Ryan McFall, who directed Backwards, which I wrote. This time I'm just execing, and I was on set in a hazmat suit all day,
living the dream,
which was pretty sweaty. Yeah. So, but it was nice. It was Bailey's home day. 12 years since I brought him home from the rescue centre, and he was on set all day. So we had a lovely time just hanging out, and
great.
Being on set was nice. And the film looks like it's going to be really good. So very exciting. What about you?
I'm excellent. In fact,
that's great.
Yeah, it was funny. I was thinking about this the other day. The caveat of, you always feel like you've got to put a caveat on the fact that you are in a particularly good place at a moment in time, especially I was just reading that Guardian piece the other day about, climate change, and it's all over basically, and everything else that's going on in the world. But I was sort of in bed with this back strain for the last 2 weeks, and the euphoria of that dissipating, it's just really weird. It's almost like you've taken a drug just because the fact that the pain has gone away and you're moving around again. And then, I'm in the middle of marking, but the marking load is light. So it's factored into what I call my summer schedule now, which is getting up very early in the morning and working as much as I can until about early afternoon, so I can get the day's work done and then kind of chill out for the rest of the time. So, and what happens with that is I find that the headspace allows you to think about more things, and I just have a lot of ideas about things I want to do, but the problem with that is I've got so many projects on the go that need completing. It's almost kind of like overwhelming yourself. Don't take anything more on,
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I would be popular if I took any more on, but it's nice to hear. I'm glad that you're on the mend from your back pain.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got a really great interview coming up, Neil. So this is one that you did, and a subject that we're on. Unusually, I don't know whether this is the first time we're revisiting a filmmaker. It probably is, isn't it? But a really good excuse to go back to a filmmaker we have covered in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what kind of piqued my interest, really, was that I saw that Hannah Strong, who's one of the editors at Little White Lies, had written a book on Sofia Coppola called Forever Young. And Hannah's been on the podcast before on a bonus episode when she visited Falmouth back in, I think, 2019. So, it was a good chance to get her back on. And also, just to think, well, actually, that Sofia Coppola's had a couple of films out since we last sort of covered her for when we had Melody Bridges on for her book on Coppola. And also I did, and we talk about this in the interview, I think that I don't know, it just feels like she shifted into a different space as a filmmaker from sort of the mid 2010s. She seems in a different sphere in terms of how she's regarded and how people talk about her, which is what I really wanted to talk to Hannah about was that trajectory of her career. So yeah, it was fun, and yeah, I think it's a good chat. I think Hannah was really interesting in terms of the way she sort of came at writing this book.
Yeah, and the book sounds really interesting. I know you've read it. I haven't read it yet, but I think what it shows is a sort of accessible depth. I think is, you know what I mean. That's what it sounds like, from what your description of it was, and the way that you talked about it, and that sense of giving a filmmaker, somebody who is, as you talk about, kind of still maybe dismissed or just pigeonholed really easily as, daughter of, and therefore, doesn't have that kind of seriousness applied to the work, and also because of the subject matter a lot of the time. But
yeah,
I think that we're definitely not going to do that, and obviously Hannah hasn't done that.
No, that was the intention. I think we got that. But no, I think what's interesting about the book is it is a lavish pictorial book for the most part. It's very visually driven, so you really get a sense of her, of her visual eye, which I think is really strong, and we'll probably talk about that on the bonus as well. She's good with images, and I think the way Hannah constructed the book was really interesting in terms of drawing out some of the things that are really unique about her work in a way that probably gets overlooked in the main conversation about her. So yeah, it was good fun.
Great. And before we get into that, though, there was a film that you've been released on. Is it DVD or Blu-ray?
It's a Blu-ray. Yeah, it's
okay.
It's a 2K transfer,
remastering.
Remastering. Yeah, it's a 2K restoration of Theodor Dreyer's Vampyr from the early 1930s, and it's a film I saw. I think I first watched this probably about 10 years ago when I did like a 31 Days of Horror thing. But it was really interesting to revisit it. It looks amazing. And again, kind of interesting thinking in terms of the sort of visually led filmmaking, and I think it's such a remarkable piece of work for 1931. The way he moves the camera around is just astonishing, particularly because the common narrative is that early sound was so restrictive in terms of what the cameras could do, and he's just like, nah, we can do all sorts. And there's a couple of moments where you can see that Scorsese's lifted for Taxi Driver in terms of sets and moving cameras above sets and stuff, and just create this really sort of otherworldly sense of space. And it's just great, it's a really beautiful film. It's clearly an influence on sort of folk horror and gothic cinema. But what was really kind of amazing this time was thinking about how it's a story about the lure of the past. We live in this kind of age of nostalgia and this kind of idea that things were always better in the past, and this is a story about a man who's he gets interested in the past, and it's the past that kind of threatens to destroy him, because he just kind of becomes obsessed with it, and the idea of it, and it's just great. It looks really beautiful. It's a Masters of Cinema release.
Sure.
Yeah, and again the idea that I sort of brought this up with Hannah, but when did films generally stop being really beautiful to look at? When did people stop caring about composition and framing and lighting and shadow and this is 90 years old, and it's absolutely astonishing to look at. So yeah, well worth checking out, and some really great features on there, some really good interviews and sort of archive stuff.
Excellent. So yeah, check that out. Again, a sort of cinephile staple, I think, going back to those early films. That was something that I saw at university, and I probably haven't seen it since, but it's like the Passion of Joan of Arc. These films that you kind of have to go back to say this is where like the virtuosity of filmmaking in terms of visual images like goes back to all the, and then go back even further if you're thinking about early Hollywood and all of that kind of stuff.
Dreyer is definitely one of my favorite filmmakers. I think it's certainly from that period, just such a great visual filmmaker.
Indeed. So yeah, let's get into the main meat of the episode. So on to Neil talking to the film critic Hannah Strong about her new book on Sofia Coppola.
understand those 5 girls who, after all these years, we can't get out of our minds. Didn't matter in the end how old they had been, or that they were girls, but only that we had loved them.
Welcome back to The Cinematologists. Hannah Strong, hello.
Hi.
Thanks so much for joining us to talk about your brand new book on Sofia Coppola.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back. It's been a lovely 3-year delay. And I've written a book in that time.
Indeed.
Done something productive.
Well done for using that time productively.
Thank you.
But no shade to anyone who didn't, obviously. So you've written a book, Sofia Coppola, Forever Young. It is a lavish treatment for the filmmaker, and it was so nice to see an American female filmmaker given that lavish treatment, considering that so often it's the same male filmmakers again, so was it a hard pitch, or was it something that people thought this is a good idea sort of straight from the bat?
Yeah, I think I was very fortunate, because obviously publishing is a difficult world, and the Abrams, so at Little White Lies, we've worked with them before on 3 books, and very much all white American filmmakers, male filmmakers. So I was contacted in probably about April or May of 2020 and asked if I would be interested in writing a book about Sofia Coppola. And I believe that someone had read an essay I wrote for Little White Lies a few years ago about Sofia Coppola and thought that it would be a kind of good fit. So the intention was always to do a book about a female filmmaker, and I think there was a kind of consensus that she was someone who there hadn't been a kind of big treatment of before. There are some great kind of more academic books out there about, but it felt like a nice kind of opportunity to do something quite comprehensive and expansive about her work. So obviously I was thrilled to be asked. So kind of went away and did my little pitch on how I wanted to approach the subject, and that was accepted. So I think it was a relatively easy sell in terms of how the publishing world normally works. I certainly expect if I do another book, it won't be quite as easy to get there. But it was Abrams were very on board for kind of doing this kind of bigger project, and fortunately Sofia was very on board as well. She was kind of really flattered that Abrams had decided to do the book, and was very glad that it was a female writer as well, because I think strangely throughout her career it has been, and I think this probably speaks to the kind of reception of her films as well, there's been a lot of kind of male writers talking about her work who maybe kind of don't or haven't always understood the nuances. There have been some supporters as well, which I talk about in the book. But it was a kind of a dream project in terms of being a film writer. There's not many things that I feel as qualified to talk about as Sofia Coppola.
Did that make it daunting though? Because I think that obviously that what comes across in the book is that you are a fan, and I don't mean that in a derisory way at all, but it's clear that you really love her work. So was it a bit daunting once it was like, go away and kind of spend your time writing this book? Kind of how are you going to kind of do her justice, but also kind of what the work means to you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think when you really care about something, it is always kind of difficult to feel like you're doing it justice. And I was very kind of scared, especially because the other books in the series are so wonderful. So the three that came before were written by Adam Naiman, and he did such a wonderful job talking about the Coen brothers, and then Paul Thomas Anderson and David Fincher. So I was kind of stepping into some big shoes, and obviously, you know, I love her films so much. I kind of wanted to do them justice, but also be sure that I was talking about them in a way that I think added to the kind of conversation and didn't just kind of regurgitate, you know, kind of positive elements, and be able to write quite kind of critically and, you know, analytically, and talk about elements of the films that I maybe feel don't work as well, or kind of do deserve a kind of more in-depth discussion. So it was definitely at the outset a very kind of, it seemed like a unthinkable task to kind of be doing such a massive undertaking. But the more I got into it, the easier it definitely felt. And I think breaking it down into manageable kind of chapters was very helpful as well. So it didn't kind of feel like I was just expected to kind of, you know, turn out this coherent 50,000 word book from scratch. It was definitely the structured nature of it was very helpful, and I think that's something that probably is very different when writing fiction or more kind of like dense books, because this obviously does have a lot of images in it and a lot of things that kind of break up the text. So yeah, I did have to kind of think a lot about long form writing, which is something I've not done since I was a student, which was quite challenging.
Yeah, and it is comprehensive. I mean, you touch on her music video work, her short film work, her commercial work, I think, which is really fascinating to see how she's an auteur in the kind of the classic sense, in terms of like there are linkages with everything that she does, which I think I do want to sort of come back to in a bit. But a little bit about the structure of it, you know, because you don't sort of tackle it chronologically, you sort of group the films together, which I think is really helpful in terms of doing that work of opening her up to a much wider kind of critical understanding, you know. But you know, was that something that you had sort of as soon as you knew you were going to do the book, or you wanted to do it, you were like, oh, this, or was it something you had to kind of work towards in terms of finding the right way to sort of create the book's structure?
Yeah, I definitely knew that I didn't want to approach it in a chronological way, just because I think that it seemed very obvious to me, and maybe not like the kind of most interesting way to think about her films, because I think they are so thematically connected. It's not kind of like there's been like, I don't feel like she's building towards a kind of thesis in the way that some filmmakers do, you know, like kind of, I think someone like Martin Scorsese, you think about something like The Irishman, it feels like that's kind of the culmination of this career of exploring kind of modern masculinity and faith and things, whereas Sofia, I think she kind of ebbs and flows in kind of the things she's discussing. So I knew that I kind of wanted to tackle it in a more unconventional way, and I knew as well from reading Adam Naiman's books that it was helpful to kind of structure this kind of project in a way that made sense to me as a writer, and then kind of try and make sure it makes sense as a reader as well. And also because we knew the book was going to be so heavily not illustrated, but so heavily visual, we knew that we would have to kind of find a way of marrying the narrative with the visual aspects. So the themes, I think when I initially was doing my pitch, I rewatched all her films a couple of times and decided, because she's only got 7 feature films, it would be easiest to kind of group them loosely in a way. I mean, I say in the book as well, like, there are certain films I think could have fitted into multiple categories. But just kind of to make it more manageable as a reader, if someone is going to sit down and kind of read it cover to cover, which apparently people have been doing, I was a bit sort of, it is a bit unwieldy because it's such a big book, but I wanted it to kind of, to be something that you could dip in and out of, but also that if you decided you wanted to read it start to finish, it would have a kind of through line. So yeah, I was very fortunate, obviously, to have a good team at Little White Lies who I could kind of bounce these ideas off. And it was the nice thing about doing it as part of the wider Little White Lies family is that I did have that kind of editorial support. I wasn't kind of going in totally blind. And Abrams were obviously a very kind of like film, you know, they're very supportive of film and were really wonderful at kind of giving their feedback and kind of what they thought made sense from a more commercial point of view, which obviously is something that film writers are not particularly concerned with. So yeah, it was to me, it's a way that would be kind of like fun and interesting, but also maintains a kind of like, you know, some sort of order to it.
Yeah, no, I think it works really well, and it's an easy read, and I mean, and it is a compliment, you know, it's very enjoyable, you know, and it flows really well, you know, and it's easy to sit down and lose a bit of time. If I didn't have a 9-month-old tugging on my leg every 3 minutes, I would have got further with it. But one of the things that the structure does, which I really liked, was you know, Coppola's a filmmaker who is very important to girls and young women. And she's kind of, you know, she's been labelled as a filmmaker for that audience. I want to talk a bit about that in a bit. But one of the things that the way you structure it does really beautifully is kind of remind of the other things that she's engaged with and talking about and really kind of in tune with. And one of the things that sort of comes out of the read is that, you know, she's really astute about men, you know, and I think she's kind of underappreciated as a kind of chronicler of masculinity, you know, and I rewatched Somewhere, which I do want to talk about in a bit as well, you know. So what were the things that sort of you discovered and that you sort of, you know, as you wrote it and were like, oh, actually this is, you know, when you kind of put those groupings in, you know, were there sort of surprises where you're like, actually, you know, there's more here than I even thought of before I started writing the book?
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely actually like the way she writes and kind of captures men is something that I hadn't maybe considered, because I think, like you say, she's thought of so much as a filmmaker who is kind of preoccupied with womanhood, and that was really interesting to kind of think about something like Somewhere, but then also On the Rocks and Lost in Translation, and kind of, I mean, I could have easily done like a, you know, one of the sections could have been called like men. But
what about the men, Hannah? Come on.
I know. Writing this book about this female author and then like, what about the men in these films? Should we unpack that? But yeah, I mean, the kind of, I think the key thing was that she's a very funny filmmaker, which I think a lot of people maybe don't appreciate, because she's not a kind of joke-driven filmmaker. She said before, she doesn't really like writing dialogue, which definitely comes across if you watch her films. They are some of the shortest screenplays you'll ever read. I think that Somewhere was about 70 pages or something, which is a crazy short for a screenplay, for a feature film. So it was really kind of rewarding to look at her films on that kind of like granular level and realize that, yeah, she does have this very dry sense of humor, and a lot of it is kind of observational and in a kind of you know, a glance or sort of something that's happening in the background. And I think that's something that I was quite keen to kind of convey within the book, is that I do think she has quite a good sense of humor, and I think she's very astute. Something like The Bling Ring, I think she's very kind of astute on privilege, and I think she's become more astute the older she's got, because I think that certainly in her early career there were a lot of charges against Sofia, that she was this kind of original nepotism baby who'd kind of come up from the Coppola dynasty, and there was some kind of resentment, I think, that's lessened over time, definitely. But I think that certainly from kind of Marie Antoinette onwards, it feels like she's quite aware of that, and not quite like unapologetic, but I think she's conscious in her filmmaking, and I think she's very aware of the position she inhabits within Hollywood. But then it was just a lot of kind of digging into performances and what makes them so special, because I think that also, sometimes the performances in her films kind of beyond, we talk about Kirsten Dunst a lot, because obviously she's always does such amazing work, but someone like Stephen Dorff, who I think is amazing in Somewhere, and people don't really talk about that film since it won the Venice, the Golden Lion, and there was all that kind of controversy about whether or not she deserved to win it. But then, obviously, like the Bling Ring, I think that Emma Watson's performance in that kind of got memed to death at the time, but it's actually, a really kind of fun and engaging and kind of accurate portrayal if you've seen any of Alexis Neyer's in real life. I was surprised at how much I got out of kind of doing this on a learning level. Just I felt like I was very fortunate to kind of have the time to get so invested in a way that I don't think journalists, film journalists in particular, really get that many opportunities, because we were so kind of, the turnover is so high for pieces. There's often just not a lot of time to kind of totally immerse yourself. And it was really rewarding to find that I only kind of loved her more after writing a book. I was worried that it would kind of kill my interest and kill my love of these films. Because once you take something you love and kind of try and make a career, out of it, it can sometimes lessen the love you have for it. But with this, I felt, and the more I talked to people who'd worked with her as well, I just felt like I was kind of even more appreciative, and even now still kind of love rewatching these films that I've seen countless times now, because I feel like even now I'm still seeing kind of more things and, kind of picking out different elements. And it's funny because since I've started doing interviews about the book, there've been things that have occurred to me and I'm like, oh, if I was writing the book now, I probably would have mentioned that. But, maybe for a revised edition in the future or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, that kind of richness that rewards repeat viewings, I mean, before talking to you and sort of reading the book, I wanted to rewatch Somewhere, which that and the Bling Ring, when they came out, they were the only films of hers that just kind of left me really kind of cold. Just didn't, and I loved Marie Antoinette when I saw it. But they just sort of left. So I thought I'll go back and rewatch Somewhere, because Alex Ross Perry's a big fan of Somewhere as well. And I know him quite well. And I'm always like, well, if he thinks it's worth, then I'll so this gave me a chance to go back, and I absolutely loved it this time round. I just thought it was a really different film to the one I'd seen, and I think it very much indicates, particularly I think something like The Beguiled, that kind of the just the level of kind of visual richness that she gets in that film. It sort of anticipates a more, I don't want to say slower, because it's that's a rubbish word, but a more contemplative kind of approach to the filmmaking.
And especially as a film about filmmaking, really, which sure. She does touch on that obviously with Lost in Translation a little bit, and kind of elements of it later in the Bling Ring, though that's obviously more about celebrity. But it's interesting that I don't think Somewhere, when you when people think about films that are about filmmaking and kind of stardom, it tends to be one that I don't think people really mention as much, which maybe it's just because it's not a particularly popular film. I think I say in the book that it is my favorite, and it still is. Like it's definitely my favorite Sofia film. But I think it's just a really astute observation of that kind of strange liminal space that actors occupy within the world, where they're kind of particularly now they're so available to the public in a lot of cases, but really shut off at the same time. And I think that loneliness in that film is something that I really, obviously in the book I talk about, I think that being one of the kind of things that she's best at exploring. But I think it's something that makes the film feel very wide, even though it's talking about a kind of personal experience that many of us will never go through. But also just seeing Los Angeles kind of treated in this very melancholy way always appeals to me. I love films about these rarefied, starry kind of cities like New York, like Los Angeles, where you get a sense for that beauty and that kind of reverence that the filmmaker has, but there is this kind of underlying element of sadness to it all. And I think I say this in the book, but I do think it's actually kind of one of her films with maybe the kind of most hopeful, like happy endings to it as well. I think it's funny because obviously, like with Lost in Translation, it's probably one of her films that got the kind of biggest tangible critical award, but it's not really one that I see people kind of giving the same kind of reverence to now. And certainly because I've obviously been programming screenings around the book, and it's not one that people and cinemas have been particularly interested in showing, which I'm kind of always a little disappointed by, because I think it's such a great film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it's you use the phrase creeping depression in the book, and I think that kind of captures so much of it. And I think it's beautifully shot by Harris Savides. I was rewatching, I was thinking films just don't look as good anymore. And this is a film it's a very quiet film. It's a very, it's a very simple film in terms of the narrative, but it just looks incredible, but not in a kind of glitzy way. It's so many films about actors and stars kind of have this almost kind of bipolar approach where it's like it's the pure glamour and the crushing lows and like, oh, life is terrible or life is amazing. And this sort of has this really interesting, very realistic, I think, sort of median kind of approach, which is actually life can just be a bit shit for everyone.
I think that so many films lean into the kind of melodrama of Hollywood, particularly, thinking about it in kind of Western filmmaking. It's obviously, European films about stardom, and I think films certainly from what I know of like Asian filmmaking and Indian filmmaking about their movie industries are very different, but purely from that kind of experience of Sofia Coppola, of being someone who's grown up surrounded by this world, I think it does really kind of highlight the a lot of working in film is just waiting around and kind of waiting for things to happen to you in a way. And I think especially for actors, it's a strange sort of kind of passive role in a lot of film making, especially for someone like Johnny Marco, who's kind of, decently famous, but not like a, not kind of Brad Pitt figure where I imagine, there's kind of people around them 24/7. He's someone that is kind of, I think we see it best illustrated in the scene where he's having his mask fitted for the film he's doing. And there's all these people kind of around him, like talking kind of about him, kind of like he's just like a part of the furniture, and then they go off and leave him to it. And there's this sense that he's just been kind of forgotten in this back room having this all this like what's it called, like
it's like the mold, isn't it? It's like the prosthetic mold. I'm not sure.
Prosthetic mold like left on him. And particularly in that scene, I think the kind of use of sound because you can hear the kind of background noise of the phone ringing and kind of distant conversations, and then you can just hear his breathing through this kind of incredibly uncomfortable looking plaster of Paris cast that he's got on his face. And I think, it just really is such a astute insight into that kind of claustrophobic space that they occupy, where, that it's so intense, but at the same time kind of so lonely, I think, a lot of the time. And that's something that, personally, obviously, I talk in the book about how I kind of relate to that. But I just think, it's a film that seems on the surface to be about a very niche experience, but it folds out into something that I think so many people can relate to. And I think especially with just kind of coming out the other side of the pandemic, I think it's, a great film about that kind of isolation as well that so many people have experienced. So I think it's definitely like technically one of her kind of outlying, achievements. I think it's a very sparse film in a way that people think of her as being very associated with opulence and this kind of maximalism. But really, if people kind of have watched a lot of her work, they know that's not really the case. I'd say it's only really in 2 of her films that we kind of get that sense. So it's been very funny whilst writing the book to kind of think about the public perception of Sofia versus the kind of actual reality of her work.
If you enjoy The Cinematologists and think the podcast is valuable to you in some way, please consider supporting us. You can do this by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or Good Pods. This really helps us get traction and visibility. Or you could share an episode on your social media. Any reviews or comments we get, we do tend to discuss on the main show. Or perhaps you could just tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Research suggests that the number one factor that aids podcast discoverability is personal recommendation. So if you have a friend or a colleague who you think would like the episode, please let them know about it. Also, for less than the price of a coffee, you could join our Patreon site. You will get access to our bonus podcasts and our monthly newsletter, in which we write an extended article and give a host of cultural recommendations. Corporate money is flooding into podcasting, and while there are brilliant shows being produced in all genres, there is a lot of formulaic content and celebrity chit-chat, which just sounds like mediocre radio. The uniqueness, authenticity, experimentation, and passion that made podcasting something unique and different is being overwhelmed by corporate formalism and institutional gatekeeping. We are a fully independent, ad-free podcast. Goes back into making our product better. Thanks very much for your continued support. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, and I was going to come to this later, but I'll sort of, it's a good point there, because I think that one of the things that sort of reading the book I was thinking about was like how she's changed as a filmmaker. There is now a big glamorous lavish book about her, which is really beautiful, but also it feels like that like her status has changed. You sort of mentioned about the lessening of the nepotism over time, that just the body of work just sort of started to speak for itself. But what's interesting is that the way she's regarded seems to have shifted as well. She seems to be taken more seriously. I'm thinking of like the criticisms of The Beguiled seemed like the kind of criticisms that male peers would face, in terms of like representation and certain kind of, political themes and stuff, as opposed to something like Marie Antoinette, which is kind of just written off, frivolous and like, kind of, so do you think that she's worked herself into having a kind of, not an equal status, but certainly a kind of status that is less based on the kind of the assumptions that were made about her career when she started out?
I think definitely the perception of her has shifted in some ways, and I think that she is kind of more respected now as a filmmaker. And not dismissed as kind of this someone who's kind of coasted on her family name. But yeah, it's interesting. There's a piece I kind of reference in the Beguiled chapter by Ira Madison, where it was written around the time that the Beguiled came out, and it talks about the idea of representation and what we ask of filmmakers. And it's interesting because I think with Sofia, a lot of kind of criticism around her work, and not just The Beguiled but her other films, is that she has quite a narrow purview, and it's like, oh, she focuses on these middle-class white characters, and there's a lot of criticism around that. And I think it's interesting because that's something that filmmakers have done for kind of decades, and it doesn't seem like it's unique to Sofia. And in some ways I think it's better that she kind of concentrates on the thing that she is good at and the worlds that she knows, rather than trying to kind of tell stories that she doesn't have the kind of insight into or the kind of life experience to talk about. And to me, that's always something in filmmaking generally I kind of go back and forth on, because I think while there are so many stories out there that we're not hearing, that we absolutely should get to hear and get to see on screen, for me it does come down to a case of like, who gets to tell those stories. And I think it would be quite disingenuous for Sofia to suddenly start making films about things of which she has no kind of understanding. And it's interesting now that she does kind of get the same criticisms that I think a lot of not even like her peers, but kind of, her father's peers get. I think it's good in a way that she's been treated, as kind of a serious auteur, and people kind of are having the same issues with something like the Beguiled that they're having with some, with not to rag on Scorsese, he's one of my favourites, but something like The Irishman, people are saying, oh, it's just a load of white guys.
And Wes Anderson seems like another one who gets,
Wes Anderson, exactly, yeah, who is definitely one of her friends and kind of peers. So I kind of go back and forth on this, and this is obviously something in the book that I do kind of talk about and I do address, because I don't think she's beyond reproach, and I do think that she has made kind of errors of judgment. I think particularly in The Beguiled and particularly in Lost in Translation, there are ways where you can see that her scope as a filmmaker is, very white and very narrow, and she hasn't always kind of, I think, responded to the justified criticism in kind of the most understanding way. But I think there is kind of something to be said for writing what you know, and kind of telling the stories that you feel best placed to tell. And there is, in my opinion, there's kind of room out there for the Sofia Coppolas of the world, and for hundreds of other filmmakers who tell different stories. And just because something is very narrow in its seeming scope, like The Virgin Suicides or like Somewhere, doesn't mean that a lot of people can't kind of find that it resonates with them, and that they can relate to it. And obviously, I've got so much out of her work whilst coming from an incredibly different background. So it's something that I'm really glad to see, is that the criticism around her work has kind of shifted a little. But it does still feel like kind of frustrating in a way to be like defending this filmmaker who I think has kind of time and time again proven that she's got the kind of the skills. And I think when I've been talking to other people about the book, and particularly women who are kind of my age, there is this feeling that it's almost like a kind of a camaraderie between us, because we're all so used to kind of saying, yes, I love Sofia Coppola, yes, I kind of know the issues around it. And it's been kind of rewarding in a way to feel less alone in kind of loving her, and kind of acknowledging the faults with her filmmaking, and maybe with her storytelling, whilst also acknowledging that there's a lot of positive things about it as well. And obviously she's, I think, have been so influential on other filmmakers and other creatives. That's kind of, in my eyes, always a good thing. She has kind of, I talk about this again in the book, her impact on like popular culture and fashion is kind of indelible. And that, I think, is very... it's very hard to do now. It's very hard to kind of break through in that way. There's so many films being made now, so many kind of, we're in this never-ending content boom, and a lot of it feels very samey, particularly kind of streaming stuff. So to have this filmmaker who is very, her films are kind of all instantly recognizable, and kind of to have your own like distinct tone of voice and distinct style is so valuable. I kind of I'm very glad she's managed to kind of hang on to that.
For sure. Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? Because like there are a lot of children of Hollywood directors or actors who have benefited from the proximity, shall we say, but they have not had that kind of cultural impact that her work has had, both in cinema but also beyond. The kind of legion, and they have careers and they make work, but they don't have that kind of legacy of, like you say, kind of really sort of influencing other sort of visual media and visual arts fields. I wonder, you sort of say in the book about writing it from the position of the target audience. Who is the target audience? And also, like, look again, the way the book sort of structures and puts these works next to each other, you do get the sense that target audience has probably been on a journey. It reminded me of Harry Potter fans in a less, in the sense that she's making films that are kind of following a certain trajectory of womanhood, that you can almost sort of track where you are as an audience next to it. Is that does that feel like, kind of something that is a valid insight, or is it, what else is kind of going on for those Sofia Coppola fans?
Yeah, I think that definitely the whole kind of reason Sofia's started making films was that she felt she wasn't seeing the kind of film she wanted to make out there. And with The Virgin Suicides, there's a quote in the book where she says she wanted to make something artful for teenage girls that she didn't feel existed. And that, I think, is a very kind of overt statement of intent about who she started making films for. And, that was obviously 20 years ago now. So her target audience at the time have grown up considerably since then. And I was just a little bit too young to kind of get The Virgin Suicides on release. So I was coming to it about 7 or 8 years later. So in some ways I'm not the target audience. I'm a little bit too young for that. But I think that her films are so much about growing up and kind of the trials and tribulations of that, regardless of whether or not you're a teenager or you're an adult who's still kind of going through that process. So I think in some ways, like, adolescence doesn't really ever end. So for me, it's her films are for teenagers, but also are for kind of anyone who feels that sort of that state of flux. And that can come across in many ways. I think On the Rocks is a really astute kind of way of observing that that feeling of kind of not knowing what you're doing with your life, or kind of not being sure of yourself and you're sure of the kind of decisions you've made. That doesn't really go away when you become an adult, or when you get the things that you've been told that you should want, like a family or a career or a partner. So, I think that she's just very good at kind of navigating the unglamorous parts of life and the kind of things that we all kind of more or less have to go through, but they're usually depicted in a more kind of, I think, bombastic way. And I think that her films are often about the kind of less glamorous elements of life, but they're presented in such a kind of beautiful way that it feels kind of more compelling, or even like, you know, that kind of, the idea of what she's actually talking about can get lost because people get so wrapped up in the kind of aesthetics. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely think, obviously I got so much out of her films as a teenager, but definitely as the more I've got older, the more I've kind of realized that they're not at all just, you know, for teenagers, and shouldn't be kind of, I think that her being kind of pigeonholed as a filmmaker for women is very kind of reductive. And it's great now that I think so many people feel more confident in saying that they love her films, because I think certainly when she only maybe got a few films out, there was this perception of who she makes films for, or you know, who enjoys her films, which I think has shifted now. And she has, well, as we were just saying, I think she's got kind of a similar sort of respect to the Wes Andersons of the world. And like any great kind of filmmaker, her work doesn't work for everyone. But I think for some reason, when it's someone like David Lynch or, you know, David Cronenberg or John Carpenter, well, we're more willing to kind of say that that's okay. Yeah. You know, when it's a genre filmmaker, it's like, oh well, of course, you know, it's not going to be for everyone. But yeah, with Sofia, for some reason, it's almost like there's a kind of reluctance to accept that not everyone is going to like it. But yeah, sorry, what was the other part of that question? I completely
No,
forgot.
I think that was it really. The other part was the Harry Potter analogy, which was a bit.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously I think she's far less irritating than J.K. Rowling. And but yeah, I mean, there's definitely that sense of, I think with Harry Potter, I definitely came of age reading Harry Potter and kind of very much enjoying those books. And I think the older I got, the more I was kind of, personally, I became kind of less interested in that world. But I think you become, with a little distance, you're able to kind of see maybe the kind of flaws with these things. Any kind of big piece of very influential pop culture. I mean, even something like Lord of the Rings, which again, I came of age when the films were sort of massive. And I think you're able to kind of dissect your relationship a little bit when you get older, and you can realize that you can still deeply care about something and deeply love something, but that doesn't mean you can't also kind of look at it critically. And that's something I was very keen with the book, is to make sure that I felt like I was doing Sofia the kind of justice and the respect of talking about her films seriously and talking about them with a kind of critical eye and engaging with other people's opinions about them, because I think that's the kind of best way you can celebrate a filmmaker, is by having the respect to kind of, you know, take their work seriously and not just pander to kind of how they might want to be perceived. And I was very fortunate that Sofia, she was very supportive, but she never at all kind of wanted to see anything or get sign off on anything. You know, she was very, very, very hands off. And it's been interesting, because a lot of people have asked, like, oh, well, did you speak to her? You know, have you met her? No, is she interviewed for the book? And I'm always like, no, I've never met her, never spoken to her. But I think in some ways that made it a lot easier, because I didn't feel like I was having to kind of worry about, you know, what she might think of it, or kind of upsetting her. Not that I say anything in the book that I think is particularly controversial, but yeah, I think that was important to me as well, is kind of making sure that I was interrogating this thing that I really do love and care about, but doing so in a way that I felt was respectful and was engaging with the wider world of criticism, and appreciating that, you know, things like Lost in Translation, things like The Beguiled, the criticism surrounding Sofia Coppola and the choices that she's made in some of her work is valid a lot of the time. And, you know, I think especially Lost in Translation, that film was made, it'll be 20 years next year. So there are elements here that haven't aged particularly well. And I think that is also like very important to kind of recognize, and to not kind of give someone a pass just because you like their work.
No, for sure. But I think what's interesting about her as a filmmaker as well is that I think that kind of that awareness and sort of reflectivity, you know, she feels like quite a reflective filmmaker. You know, the works as they go on seem to be addressing some of the just her past and some of the other, she's trying to evolve as a filmmaker. She's trying to kind of grow, I think, and that's, those. I mean, I love The Bogard and I love Lost in Translation, and I can see the criticisms, but I also think that they're really great movies, as well. You mentioned sort of kind of having that sort of same status as her peers. You also say that there's a Coppola shot. So what is the Coppola shot?
Yeah. I mean, this is again, I think it's something that really speaks to kind of her auteur, vision, and it's something that even as far back as her short film Lick the Star, which came out the year before The Virgin Suicides, it's this shot that we see in every single one of her films where there will be a character looking out of a window, usually in a moving vehicle, and I think sometimes you see them from the inside of the car, sometimes from the outside of the car, but to me it's this kind of summation of the idea of like isolation and yearning that I think in every single one of her films are kind of about that in one way or another. And it was fun to kind of pick out something that I think is very tangible within her work, that I could, just say like, there it is across this kind of body of work. But also to kind of have a common thread, because even though her films, do take place over kind of centuries and countries and about very different subject matter, I think they're all kind of about a similar sort of feeling, or a similar group of feelings, I should say. And that was like, I'm not the most, because I didn't study filmmaking at university. I've never done, I think I've done one film course in my lifetime. So I've never had the kind of academic language, and that's always made me feel very insecure about my writing, because I read so many wonderful writers who can talk about this is what X means in the context of this filmmaker, and they can talk about like, oh yes, this angle, or this this like width of shot, this aspect ratio, and that's just not. It's like complex mathematics to me. Like I a lot of the time it just goes completely over my head. So it was nice to kind of feel like over the course of writing the book, I felt like I was kind of understanding film more, and kind of understanding why a filmmaker like Sofia Coppola does the things she does, and speaking to people like Philip Lassorde and Sarah Flack, her editor, was so helpful, because it really gave me that kind of insight into the technical elements, because I think she is as well. She's a very technically based filmmaker, and she has very specific ideas about the way she wants to shoot things and the way she wants things to look. And particularly, I mean, in the interview with Philip, it's very evident that she's quite particular. And we always think of people like Scorsese, people like Christopher Nolan as being the kind of like the film, we've got to shoot it on film. It's got to, you can be this aspect ratio. But I think she's definitely someone who also kind of fits into that idea of really wanting to preserve like the sanctity of filmmaking in a way. And I think because she's also got this real background in fine art and a real appreciation for fine art, that she thinks in images a lot, and that's why it's so easy, I think, for stills from her films to kind of do the rounds on Instagram or on Twitter or whatever, because she's such a visually driven filmmaker. And I think the kind of Coppola shot is a real kind of, I think for her maybe it's like a nice like little signature in a way, but it's also really easy kind of shorthand for the sort of wider themes that branch across this whole like body of work.
Yeah. And one of the things as well, reading the book, that it made me think of is that it feels autobiographical. So much of her background and her early story is sort of hanging around, traveling, sort of on film sets or between places. Like there's a sense of that looking out and waiting and sort of looking around, and I think that's where a lot of her observational sort of acumen comes from. But it almost felt like, you could, but it's interesting what you say, because I think that sort of that sort of anxiety about writing is always there, but the book is is passionate and honest, and really insightful, and I think it does the job of good writing in that sense. And also and also like I hate reading stuff where it's someone's written it from a point of view that's not shifted. You write to know, and I think it's clear in the book that this is someone sort of doing the work of discovery on the page, which is again so much what a lot of her films feel like. They feel kind of like they're alive and engaged in really interesting ways. You mentioned sort of interviewing some of the people. Towards the end of the book, you've got these great interviews with some of her collaborators. Including a fantastic interview with Kirsten Dunst, which is she's just brilliant in that interview. Like such a good interview with her, where
I really caught her at the good time, because it was just before she went on the kind of press trail for Power of the Dog. So I think it was a great time. She wasn't exhausted yet.
Always good. But she expresses her cinephile bona fides by being a big fan of Daisies, the Vera Chilova film. But what was really interesting about her answers, but also your question, was the conversation. Was sort of evident in the rest of the book, in how you reach out beyond the films. So each section has these inspirations. So you tie her work to the wider sort of to wider cinema history, which is just, I think, really it's just really lovely and really really nice. And in that interview, sort of talking about how, I think for both of you really, like that Virgin Suicides is a gateway to Picnic at Hanging Rock, which just made me think like that she's a filmmaker that feels like a cinephile's filmmaker, and then it made me think about what is cinephilia in this moment. But for me, it's what it's always been, which is curiosity. Like you watch something, and it's a gateway to other things. And I thought it was really
absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I think that one of the most rewarding elements of working on the book was discovering other films and the films that inspired Sofia, and even just films that she loves. She's someone that talks really passionately about cinema and about the cinema she grew up watching. And I mean, obviously, when you come from that family, of course, I think you're bound to grow up loving cinema. And it's interesting because obviously, her cousin is Nicolas Cage, and he did this amazing Reddit interview a few weeks ago where he was talking about the films that he loves. And I don't come from that world at all. My family aren't really into cinema. So I was very jealous in a way. I was thinking, it must be so nice to kind of grow up in this environment where that kind of film curiosity is like celebrated, and there's a real kind of reverence for the art of cinema. But doing the kind of inspirations sections, for me, it was so tough in a way, because there's so many films that I wanted to talk about that I just didn't have room to talk about, because it was only like a supplementary bit of the book. But things like Amadeus and things like Stanley Kubrick's Lolita and Leaving Las Vegas, all these kind of amazing works of cinema that I think it's very obvious when you kind of watch her films, knowing those kind of inspirations, you can see the kind of through line, and you can see her, or it's almost like an interpolation sometimes within the Sofia Coppola world of these great artists that she loves. And it feels very, very kind of, there's obviously a reverence for these filmmakers, but it's also very playful. I mean, something like the pink wigs in Marie Antoinette is kind of a nod to Amadeus. And that curiosity of hers as a filmmaker and as a person, I think, is something that I, again, like really connect to, because the reason I love films, I think, is that kind of sating my kind of curiosity about the world. And also to realize that she is a filmmaker who watches so many films. And I think sometimes with filmmakers, particularly now more than ever, there's sometimes a sense that filmmakers aren't watching as many films as they should. And I don't know if it's like a time thing or what, but it's, I think it also feeds into what I was saying earlier about having a very distinct visual identity as a filmmaker. And I think that only comes about from learning as much as you can about film. And I think it's a similar thing with writing. The best writers I know are the ones that kind of read the most and are constantly writing. You only kind of get better about it through doing it. And I think that's, is probably why, as someone who, before I even got into films, I loved writing. And I think that's why I feel there's such a kind of deep connection between the two, because they both, like you say, they have this element of curiosity and a desire to kind of understand and acquire knowledge. And I think that, that's one of the things I love about watching her films, is that I feel like I come out with like 10 other films that I want to go and watch. Yeah. And even watching her behind the scenes films, which a lot of them were shot by her mother on the sets. There's an amazing one for Somewhere where Stephen Dorff's like got this big stack of DVDs in his hotel room at the Chateau Marmont, and one of them's Paper Moon, and there's a few others. And he's talking about Sofia giving him this homework, which was just a big stack of DVDs, and just saying like, go in and watch these and like tell me kind of what you think. And I think that's such a lovely thing as a filmmaker, and to kind of share that knowledge with your cast and with your collaborators, and kind of be someone who really values keeping the kind of love of film alive, and not pretending that you're the first person to ever make a movie is something that I think is really valuable. And I think, her films are films for people that just generally love movies and want to kind of discover more cinema.
Yeah, and it's nice to see that thread in the book, because I think, like you say, it puts her in the same sphere as those lauded male filmmakers like Scorsese and Tarantino. We're all told how what they show. And it's nice to see that it's just nice to see again, because from a nerd point of view, it's nice to see what she's engaging with, and hopefully the book will lead more people to those great movies, which are really broad range.
I hope so. Yeah. I really hope so.
So before we wrap up, the Bling Ring, you're gonna have to try and pitch me on rewatching the Bling Ring.
Is that one that you're not?
It's the only one. Yeah, it's the only one now. I haven't gone back to it since I saw it. But yeah, I'm just,
I also, when the Bling Ring came out, I was kind of diametrically opposed to it. I thought it was just this very vapid like celebration of something that I thought was totally not worth my time. And I think because it came out round about the time that I think there was a huge kind of reality television boom, and I was God, how old was I? I was about 19, I think, when the film came out, and I was very much like, oh no, the Kardashians and whatnot, not my thing at all, not kind of interested in that. So I wasn't particularly keen to revisit it for doing the book. It was definitely, I think, out of all her films, it was the one that I was like, I don't really like it. And somehow through the process of doing the book, I actually think it's really great, and kind of maybe one of her again, she only got 7 films. It's hard to say, it's one of her best when there's only 7 of them to begin with. But no, I do think it's actually a film which has like a lot to say about an era which is very, it's not that long from where we are now, but also feels very different to where we are now. It was this kind of, this age of like insane cultural consumption, but also the birth of like kind of social media, and the things that happen in the Bling Ring are only possible because of the advent of social media. And that to me is fascinating. I think it captures a really interesting moment in time in a way that not many films have been able to do. I'd maybe like put it alongside Uncut Gems in terms of like being able to pinpoint a very specific moment in time, which I think a lot of filmmakers haven't really kind of tried to make work about what is it? It's not like late noughties, I guess, before we got into the kind of the meat of the 2010s. It's like, that 2012, 2011, 2013 sweet spot. So not only do I think it's a very good like representation of that strange political time we were living in, I think it's also like a very astute film about the kind of flip side of teendom that we see in something like Virgin Suicides or Marie Antoinette, where in The Bling Ring it's this group of very kind of outwardly obnoxious and kind of unlikable teenagers, but there's this like sort of simmering undercurrent of like, why are these teenagers the way they are, and what has kind of made them become these quite obnoxious, kind of hooligans, like running around Los Angeles, partying with celebrities and then robbing them by the cover of darkness. And I think it speaks to that kind of feeling as a young person and as an adult often of wanting very desperately to belong. And particularly, I think, as someone who moved to a big city at 18 and felt that way for a very, very long time, that element of kind of wanting your life to like be kind of more extraordinary than it is. And I think it's fascinating to see someone like Sofia Coppola, who is such a celebrity and has been such a celebrity, since she was born, basically, making this film about this kind of very strange, like middle-class teenage impulse to kind of want to be famous. And it's something that I think we've gradually kind of shifted away from that in society, and there's more of a kind of critical perception of celebrities now. And I think it's, rightly so. I think it's there's more balance now, but certainly, God, in the age that it's talking about, there was this kind of bizarre reverence, I think, that maybe people are kind of more thoughtful about now. But yeah, I think it's such a strange and funny film, and it must have been so hard for Sofia Coppola to make a film which is so ugly, because it's a deeply ugly film in many ways, and very gaudy. And there's a wonderful on the DVD there's a wonderful like video of them, of Sofia and the team talking about making the film and talking about that inspiration being this kind of, I talk about this in the book a little bit, but this the inspiration was this picture they had of a sort of peach-coloured, like washed-out mansion in Calabasas, and it's just so diametrically opposed from the kind of beauty and the celebration of uniqueness that I think is in Sofia Coppola's films. So yeah, I think it's again, it's not for everyone, but I think it is a very a really interesting like kind of relic. And obviously, I mean, the kind of the big film that I think it ties really well with is Gus Van Sant's To Die For, which I think is another amazing kind of portrait of 90s celebrity. That also kind of like, has these true crime elements, and features this amazing Nicole Kidman performance. So, I think that in itself makes a really cracking double bill. But I think, it's one of her more challenging films, and I definitely get why it was kind of not liked on release. But yeah, I think it's just such fun, and it really does, beneath that kind of gaudy, jarring surface of the Valley Girl accents, it's really smart about like celebrity and about the kind of isolation of being a teenager, and that impulse to kind of make yourself seem more interesting in any way that I think teenagers kind of, for better or worse, all are guilty of at some point. So yeah, I hope that's like some sort of like sell to kind of reconsidering it.
Absolutely, yep. You've done well there. I'll definitely give it another another go. But yeah, thank you for the book. I think it's absolutely wonderful. Congratulations. I think people will get so much out of it, as with her work, which I think you've done a really beautiful job of kind of engaging with and celebrating, but also kind of reckoning with in a critical sense. So yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I shall see you in a couple of weeks in Cannes.
Yes, very excited.
Absolutely. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, Hannah.
Bye.
Thanks so much to Hannah for her time and for kind of engaging with the questions. Really appreciated it. And yeah, hope to catch up with her in Cannes in a week or so. But Dario, what did you make of the chat and the conversation that came out?
Well, nicely slipped in there. I've just piqued my jealousy. I'm sorry, but you
Sorry,
guys are
bud.
going to Cannes. My girlfriend is going to meet a friend of hers. Sorry, this is a big aside, but she's going to meet a friend of hers in Paris. And this friend of hers has got a bit of cash and has just paid for tickets to the French Open final.
Oh man,
The French Open tennis final. And I'm like, there's people doing stuff that I'm just would kill for at the moment. And I'm just gutted about it.
Sorry, bud.
Anyway, sorry. I can hear the world's tiniest violin playing right now. Anyway, I don't really want to add too much because it's an in-depth interview that I don't think needs me to chime in, having not read the book. Let's put it that way. I mean, we can talk about Somewhere, which I know you've seen and I watched last night, which is going to be the chat in the bonus. The one thing that I did want to sort of just maybe mention or maybe talk to you about, and reflecting on what Hannah had said and out of one of the questions that you asked, related to this idea of the criticism of Sofia Coppola and her subject matter. And, the idea that she's making middle-class movies or even, whatever that category is in America, the Hollywood rich, the Hollywood elite, or, celebrity culture. And, these are lives that are, she's approaching this notion of alienation from a very privileged position. And it's almost like the idea that what have these people got to complain about, really?
Yeah.
And does she therefore have a ceiling in terms of, or a narrowness maybe in terms of her potential of what she can do as a filmmaker?
Yeah.
And, Hannah's answer to that, which I've heard before, is, well, here is somebody who's writing what they know, and, somebody who doesn't perhaps, or is self-reflexive enough not to, go off and make movies about, I don't know, the working class in the Rust Belt or something in America, because it doesn't chime with her experience. And Hannah, I think, she wasn't sort of overt about this. I think there is an ambivalence there in her answer. And I think that it's a problem to just always say that filmmakers should be making films about essentially aligning with who they are as people, aligning with their identity. And it does come from this position, I think we see in culture right now, that you can't speak for somebody else. Who are you to speak for somebody else? And I always find this a really problematic line, because where do you draw the line? It's like, can a white person make a movie about a black experience? You could argue there's a lot of people say, no, well, you can't do that because you don't represent that, and B, you don't have any life experience of that. But then, you take that further. Can a man make an adequate film that has a female protagonist in it? And you could apply that to class as well. As you sort of mentioned within Coppola's work. And I think it's just really problematic. And I see that sense of, you can look at so many filmmakers who have made great movies and they're outsiders, and often that outsider eye gives an insight that the insider doesn't have. And I just think that sort of political starting point leads to a narrow understanding of what experience is. And I think it's one of the problems and one of the directions that culture has gone in that I think is quite simplistic and basic, and also lacking in a nuanced understanding of what art should strive to do at its very best. And I guess it's to do with how you do it and the context of doing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. I think it's interesting to look at Coppola's trajectory and see, she made somewhere, I think, after Marie Antoinette, which was heavily criticised,
Sure.
Which is a stretch away from the kinds of early works, tonally, thematically. I think, it's very much more overtly feminist than the others. I think there's a really interesting, and I wrote about this, about Marie Antoinette, and its portrayal of the role of women in society, I think is really interesting. But it does it in such a kind of quote unquote postmodern way. It kind of really just riled people up, and then she reverted back to something quite safe with Somewhere. And I think after The Beguiled, which wasn't anywhere near as poorly received, it was very well received, but it did receive criticism for its kind of handling of race, or non-handling of race, really, in that kind of context. And then she goes back to make On the Rocks, which feels like a much safer kind of screwball, in a world that is much, much closer to her own experience. So it's interesting. I think that, there seems to be an awareness of, like, maybe the time she's trying, people are, not necessarily getting, or I think, she's maybe not doing that element, not going far enough, enough. You mentioned, it would be nice to see her do a body horror, and something like that would be fascinating. Like, how would, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's like, if you like a filmmaker and you're interested in how they see the world or how they tell stories, you kind of want to see them push, or at least we do. It's not really a good time for that, but I think that it would be really interesting to, rather than just be like, a Sofia Coppola Marvel movie. Yeah, I'd love to see a Sofia Coppola folk horror or a Sofia Coppola sci-fi movie. What would that look like? In a way that Claire Denis done that in the last couple of years. What does it mean when these filmmakers do stretch into those genre spaces?
Yeah, and again, is it because, like, Sofia Coppola does have a sort of blind spot when it comes to the use of quote unquote others, non-Americans, to make the American characters feel uncomfortable? And I think it is one of the criticisms that have been leveled at her that maybe then makes her pull back. I better go back to the safety of what I know, because I know that was a thing about Lost in Translation and the whole otherness of Japanese culture, and there's a little bit of it in Somewhere as well with Italian culture, which is amazing because obviously she is related to that, but it's used in a way that just to make Stephen Dorff in that moment in Somewhere, which we'll talk about more in the bonus, to make him feel like weirded out that all this Italianness is happening around him, and there maybe is a sort of a limitation there, but that's the thing. I think that the problem is that Sofia Coppola is probably not given the flexibility or the leeway that male filmmakers are for their limitations. Do you know what I mean? It's like all filmmakers have limitations. Everybody has limitations in every line of work that they're in. But it's like, here are your limitations. Let's really focus on them and hammer them. Whereas maybe things are changing now where, I don't think male filmmakers anymore can kind of just easily get away with problematic portrayals or uses of culture in unsavory ways. But obviously, historically they have, So it's an interesting one that maybe, and I agree with some of your conversation about her getting very specifically hammered because everybody knows whose daughter she is, and that is, I just think that is true,
Yeah, and I think what is kind of testament to her as a filmmaker is that she keeps going, and I know she has in a position to do so, but I think that, it's not a given that, and also that, she's still willing to try and make interesting work. I sort of mentioned in there that there are other kind of nepotistic recipients, whose work is nowhere near as interesting. It's nowhere near as visually bold or cinematic, or even trying to engage with other things. And I think that's what's interesting about The Beguiled, which I particularly like, is like it does fall down possibly on its kind of, but it's kind of its portrayal of a kind of group of women under incredible stress, and this kind of erotic power that comes into that space is absolutely brilliantly handled. It's really interesting in and of itself, and I do think that she is making interesting work. On the Rocks was throwaway but enjoyable, I thought, but I think she's definitely earned the right to be a filmmaker that's discussed in kind of complicated terms, and I hope that she continues to be so. And I think one of the other things that Hannah's book does really well is remind that, again, which I think is kind of interesting, is like she may be the daughter of someone very, very famous in film, a part of a kind of family dynasty, but the work that she's done on her own terms in terms of her cinephilia is kind of undeniable. Like she might have been handed opportunities, but I don't think she's wasted those opportunities, and I think she's tried to forge her own identity as a filmmaker in a really interesting way, which so many male sort of sons of have not done. Which is the kind of twice as hard work that you might have to do if you're a woman, but I think that it's a rich body of work that is her own. I don't think you could say, they don't feel like Francis Ford Coppola films. They feel like Sofia Coppola films.
That's very true. So yes, great interview. Thank you very much again, Hannah, for coming on. We're now going to go over to the bonus episode where we're going to discuss in quite a bit of detail maybe the film Somewhere, because I think we've got an interesting take in terms of Neil's, because we've watched it again for the second time, both of us, and had almost sort of reverse reactions in a way, which is kind of interesting. So we'll see you over there. Please come and join us if you're a Patreon member. If you're not, think about signing up. It's only a couple of quid. If you enjoy the Cinematologists podcast, you think the work that we do is valuable to you, please consider helping us out with our running costs. But Neil, great to talk to you as always.
You too. Yeah, thanks. Lovely chat as per.
And we shall see you on the next episode. This has been the Cinematologist podcast. Thanks for listening.